The more time I spent out here, there was just something so foreign from what I was used to about the high desert, from the texture to the landscape to the little shops.
Welcome to the Desert Lady Diaries podcast, conversations with women who have found their home in the Mojave Desert. I'm Dawn Davis, and this is episode 144. Find out more about the podcast at desertladydiaries.com and engage with the guests, other listeners, or me on Facebook and Instagram at Desert Lady Diaries.
Jessica Bennett has spent her award-winning journalism career focusing a gender lens on social issues and culture. Jessica was the first ever gender editor of the New York Times, where she is now an editor at large. She is the author of Feminist Fight Club and This Is 18, Lives Through Girls' Eyes. Jessica Bennett resides in Brooklyn, New York and Yucca Valley, having discovered it over 10 years ago. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Sure. So what was your first experience with desert?
Yeah, I was thinking about this recently. It was actually in high school. So I grew up in Seattle, the opposite of desert, extremely wet and gray all the time, which is probably why I am so desperate for sun. But there was something called desert school that we went to in, junior or senior year, where we basically went to Eastern Washington on like a week-long field trip, and we learned to do desert things like identify cacti and different plants and learn how to rock climb. And gosh, what else? I don't know. I think there was a lot of sneaking away because we were teenagers, but it was the first time that I had experienced that climate. And I just loved it. I loved the dryness of it. I am allergic to everything. And it was like the one place where I didn't constantly have allergies and wasn't sneezing everywhere or getting mosquito bites that were swelling up or all of the other things that happen when you have allergies. And I kind of forgot that had been this really forming experience for me until years later when I came out here.
And what brought you out here?
I think honestly, this is like such a cliche, but probably like a series of bachelorette parties in Palm Springs that everyone likes to seem to do. And then taking some day trips to go hiking and to go see the park, and eventually spending more and more time out here and less time in Palm Springs. And then eventually stopped going to Palm Springs altogether. I mean, occasionally, nothing against Palm Springs, but.
No, I call it civilization because I moved from the East Coast. I've been to a number of other East Coast cities, but then ultimately to LA and then here. And I think I call it civilization. You can go down and sit at a table with a white tablecloth and get a nice meal and whatever.
Yeah.
And then come back. Right. Exactly. Yeah. Right. Exactly. Not in this age. What do you think it was about this part of the desert that drew you from Palm Springs? What are some of the things, were there feelings that you were having or experiences you were having?
Yeah. I mean, I think initially it was like, there's a national park. This is a thing that we should do. It's supposed to be really cool. But the more time I spent out here, there was just something so foreign from what I was used to about the high desert, from the texture to the landscape to the little shops. My parents were hippies who had moved from the East Coast to Seattle, and the kind of hippie vibe in downtown Joshua Tree I very much kind of related to as part of my upbringing. And it's just so incredibly different. I, of course, moved from Seattle to New York and have lived there now for almost 2 decades, and it couldn't possibly be more different, but it was so serene, and I met interesting people, and the vibe was just so different that I just wanted to explore, and I wanted to keep exploring.
You've made a bit more of a commitment to the area because you've purchased property, right?
Yes. So eventually I was spending so much money on Airbnbs, coming out multiple times a year with friends or by myself with my husband, that I was like, should we invest here? Like, actually, this could be a really incredible place to spend time and spend winters potentially. And the prices were pretty reasonable. And so 2 years ago now, we made the dive and we bought a house on the Mesa in Yucca Valley, sight unseen. We had like 30 days to get out of it, but we had a friend from LA go vet it for us. And we were afraid it was going to sell quickly, and began what is a continuing and sort of comedy of errors home renovation that is ongoing.
I read about it somewhere. I'm not sure if it was one of the Instagrams or
Yeah.
a blog that you do. Share some of that experience, because it is, I have people come in the shop downtown and they talk about, oh, we're thinking about buying property and then getting an RV and putting it there. And then we can come out on weekends. I'm like, put it on property where you have a neighbor that will be there all the time to watch it. And they look at me like I'm crazy, but explain.
Yeah. Well, so my dad actually does for a living, or has, he's retired now, but he bought and sold houses and would do rental properties and buy fixer uppers. And so I grew up like around fixing up of homes. And while I don't know anything about fixing up a home, I figured you can hire people to do that. I think this is probably not a particularly unique story, but we are New Yorkers. I'm incredibly high strung and demanding and all of the stereotypes, which in many ways are true, except that I think we're very nice. And I want things done, and I want them done perfectly, and I want them done now.
We're nice, but we're honest.
Yes.
That's what I like to say about East Coasters. They're nice, but they're honest. Yes.
Exactly. And, I'd rather have the blunt, honest answer than
exactly
the nicer, passive one. I knew I was not going to get that here. Like, it's a different culture. That's okay. And gosh, I guess like long story short, we've gone through a number of contractors. The first one basically ghosted us one day and never returned. The house got broken into twice when we hadn't moved in yet, but we had a lot of tools and other random things here. We got married out here a little bit over a year ago. And so the only thing we had of substance that was in the house was 40 bottles of champagne for the wedding, like nice champagne for the wedding that got stolen. So like, as far as break-ins go, we were very lucky, but it was hilarious because literally a police report was like, tools and 2 cases of champagne or whatever. Luckily, through meeting people here and getting connected to other people, found a new contractor, and it's just been a much slower process than we anticipated. And then COVID happened, and it's hard to manage something like that from across the country, no matter how type A you are. So it's been like a real learning experience for me and an exercise in patience, which is probably good for me overall.
Right. So now I noticed in some of the photos you sent me that I'll be using when I put the podcast out, you are out at King of the Hammers. Are you riders? And what do you ride? Or do you just go for the adventure and the fun of it?
We're not riders. At our apartment in Brooklyn, we live next door to a motorcycle shop that's also a coffee shop. And so we've ended up spending a lot of time there and getting to know all of them. But we're definitely not riders. There's just so many things about the desert that are so different from the way that I grew up and the life that I lead in other places. And one of those, which my husband has really embraced, is owning a lot of cars and a lot of big cars and like unworking cars that you just keep in your yard, and you have to have a yard car, and going off-roading. And so we thought it was really fun. And so we wanted to do it. And we have friends who are locals here and had mentioned King of the Hammers. And we were like, I don't really know what to expect, but I have to go see this. And it was very fun.
So for someone listening who doesn't know what King of the Hammers is, can you give them kind of a high level explanation of what goes on out there?
Yes. Yeah. How do I not offend real car people? So it's basically like a giant monster truck festival out in the desert. I've heard it called Burning Man for Hicks or for rednecks, possibly. But essentially a bunch of people, and I'm probably doing a terrible job because I've only been once. I'm by no means a local, but people bring their off-roading vehicles and they soup them up and they put flags on them. And we're in a mask world now, but wearing masks, pre-COVID, you have to wear bandana because the dust will be flying in your face. And you go and you sort of like, it's one part like checking out each other's vehicles and tailgating and, sitting in the backs of trucks, and some people camp. And then there are various races and off-roading spectacles, and it's just wild. And there's like a little downtown area that has concerts and music and food. And yeah, it's like a festival of monster trucks, essentially.
Fun. And it's coming back. I think it starts the end of January, if I'm not mistaken. I thought I saw something either on Facebook or in the paper about it.
Yeah,
coming
I
up.
saw it.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure if it was still going on with COVID, but I guess everyone is masked and you're in the middle of nowhere. So we'll have to find out.
Yeah. Talk to me about how a girl that grows up in Seattle ends up in New York City. Did you have relatives there that you went back? Because you said your parents were from New York. Or was it school or was it job? How was it that you ended up in New York City?
Well, initially it was journalism. So I'm a journalist. I knew I wanted to be a journalist. And when I got out of college, it was like, okay, you can move to a small town and work for a local newspaper, or you can move to New York City and you can try to do the thing that so many people have tried to do before, where you try to get a job and probably you work a waitressing job while you're interning or whatever it was, which is what I ended up doing. But you try to work for a magazine or one of the bigger national publications. And so that's what I did. But my dad grew up here. He's a New Yorker. And so I always had a little bit of that in my personality that I don't think I even realized until I moved to the East Coast and sort of like breathed this sigh of relief of like, oh my God, these are my people. They say what they mean. They don't bullshit. They're fast talkers. I really like this. They're sarcastic. And Seattle is like the complete opposite of that. It's like passive aggressive everything. Nobody can say what they really mean. There's a joke about the Seattle no. No one can ever say no. So you just like do this run around forever. And so when I got to the East Coast, and it was like people are aggressive, but in a way that I really liked. I felt like I had found my family in a way. And so I ended up getting a journalism job. I did many internships and worked in many bars, but then I finally got a staff job at Newsweek magazine. And I have been there ever since.
Talk to me about gender editor, what that means, and why it was a necessary thing for you to do.
When I was hired as gender editor, people were constantly like, what the hell is a gender editor? And I had to like come up with these one-liners to explain it. But my favorite one was, it's like a regular editor, but angrier. And essentially, my job was to be a regular editor. I am a writer. I am an editor. I have long focused on women's issues and gender issues, with that as my area of expertise. And it was the first time that the New York Times had created such a position or hired someone for such a position. And it was something that at the time I took on that role, which was like late 2016, early 2017, a lot of publications were talking about and thinking about. And I think sort of in the way that we see now in the media, there's a big conversation being had about diversity in newsrooms. Of how can you accurately cover things like Black Lives Matter if you have this extremely white, homogenous group of reporters and editors? That conversation was being had around women's issues and around LGBTQ issues. And so my job was to cover regular stories, but think about ways that we could better reach women readers and also cover things through a gender lens.
Do you think that there are some, I don't know quite how to phrase this. I find myself getting tripped up, if you will, in some conversations more having to do with gay, lesbian, non-binary. And maybe because of my age, I am not hip to the language or terms being used. Have you found that in your work?
The language is changing so fast. So to just give an example that's very relevant to me is that when I was applying for this job, first ever gender editor, the job posting was about women, but they were calling it a gender editor because at that time in 2016, it was like, I covered gender issues and that meant you covered women's issues. And so when I got into the role, already it was like, is gender really the right word for this? Like LGBTQ issues are also extremely important. And we have another team that covers that, but should we be working across? And even now, like, I think I'm no longer in the role. I'm in a more generalist role as a kind of a roving editor and writer. But when I talk about it today, people assume that I was the LGBTQIA plus editor. And I was really focused on engaging women readers because at the time we knew that women were the minority of subscribers and engaged users at the New York Times, and we wanted to close that gap. So I think the language is changing incredibly rapidly, and it can be tricky. So certainly, I think like all the journalists that I work with often go to organizations like GLAAD, who can help advise on the best language to use or which language is outdated. And we think about this a lot, but it requires really keeping up to date, especially with social media and how rapidly linguistics are changing.
Right. And I don't like to use my age as an excuse, but I'm also not someone who travels regularly in those sort of circles. And I feel like there are circles, even though we are trying to break those circles down. So for me personally, I find it hard to keep up. And then sometimes you get in a conversation on social media and you use a term and somebody jumps on you, and we're trying to advance the conversation. And by you shaming me for not using the right term, I don't know that that's the best way to educate me.
Right. Which sort of brings us to like the cancel culture that we're living in, the online shaming cancel culture, whatever you want to call it, that we're living in, where there's no nuance, and the line between someone making an honest mistake and wanting to correct it and trying to do better, and a person who's actually aggressively misgendering someone or whatever it might be, or not recognizing their identity, is thin. It's hard to tell in a 240 character tweet. And I don't know, that's a thing that I've been thinking about a lot and covering in some of my recent work, because it's toxic, and we are existing in these silos and these bubbles where there's such a huge gap, and it extends in more ways than just gender issues.
Do you have any sense of a dying out of, say, a actual physical newspaper or magazine, or do you have any inside information or perspective on that's never going to happen? There's always going to be paper. Personally, I enjoy picking up my local High Desert Star on Wednesday and reading it with the paper in my hand.
Yeah.
I do read the online weekend version, but I'm not a big fan of it.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, I will say that I don't subscribe to any print publications, which is a weird thing for a journalist, including the one that I write for. I read it all online. And there would definitely be times when I'd be at work where people would be like, well, didn't you see the print layout or whatever? And I'm like, no, where am I supposed to find that? But
Bodega on the corner.
Yes, exactly. I also appreciate the analog form, and I love magazines, and I came up working in magazines, and I love design, and I love print design. And so from that extent, like I'm looking right now, I found this magazine at the Sky Mall swap meet called Sir ! It's like a men's magazine from the 1950s.
Oh my goodness.
Sir! A magazine for males. And then the headline is Flying Saucers on My Ranch. But I love flipping through it. I love the artifacts and the photography and the illustrations. But, the reality is most of us are consuming online now, and it's expensive to print things on paper. And, there's a huge debate / crisis happening around local newspapers. I too love reading the Desert Star, and I think it's so important to have it, because national publications like the Times can't have reporters in every local place, and those reporters just aren't understanding what's happening in local communities. So I'm very pro local newspapers, while also realizing, I came up in my career at a time when it was like things were dying out as I got jobs. So my first ever internship was at my local newspaper, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, which went completely out of business a couple of years later. I went to college in Boston, and I got an internship at the Boston Globe, which was doing like huge, massive cuts and layoffs while I was there. And it was a very grim place. My first newspaper job in New York was at the Village Voice, like the iconic alt weekly, which was sold to this company in Texas while I was working there. And like everyone was getting laid off and freaking out. And then when I got what I mentioned before, my first real staff job at Newsweek magazine, which I had for a number of years, but the way that it all ended up was the magazine was put up for sale. It was purchased by a man for $1 plus the debt. and then it was merged with the digital publication and like basically went out of print. So I'm very aware that it's a hard time to be in media and print media, especially, while also really valuing it.
Let's switch gears. Were you still working for the newspaper when you were writing your books?
So I've sort of gone back and forth between being a freelance writer and a staff writer.
Okay.
And so when I worked on my first book, I was freelancing. And actually, I wrote part of it out here in the desert, but I was always writing articles in the background. And so I was writing for the New York Times for a long time before I ended up taking a staff position. But freelancing gave me more flexibility to, work on crazy writer hours and at odd times and procrastinate and then pull all-nighters and all the things that I'm working on not doing. Freelancing really gives you the freedom to do that.
Yes, for sure. So the first book was Feminine Fight Club. And for someone who's not familiar, just talk a little bit about how that came about.
So I am in a real life feminist fight club. We do not fight each other, but we fight sexism and we fight patriarchy. And it always was kind of a joke because we were in this women's group. All of us were starting our careers. We were in New York City. It started a decade ago. And we would gather and we would talk about some of the struggles we were facing as women in creative fields. But we didn't talk about the club outside of the club. And so we would joke that it was like a feminist fight club, which is where the inspiration came from for the book. And so what the book really aims to do is be a manual for people starting their careers who want to figure out ways to push back against sexism, against stereotypes, against biases, and all of these tropes, some of them subtle and micro, that still very much exist in every workplace. And so it's rooted in research in that there's real data behind effective ways you can negotiate a raise or overcome your imposter syndrome. But as someone who had been writing about these issues for so long, we were often focusing on the problem and not so much looking at solutions. And so I really wanted to provide like practical things that you could do on a day-to-day basis to like get that guy who keeps interrupting you when you're trying to speak in a meeting to shut up. And then the backdrop to it is my own feminist fight club and this group of women that I have grown in my career with and who have supported me along the way.
With that, you did a number of speaking engagements. Did you go cross country for that, or was it strictly localized in New York?
Yeah, I went on a real book tour, which was really fun. And I have a number of friends who've released books in the last year during COVID, and everything's remote now. No, everything's canceled. So I'm just so grateful that I was able to do that. And yeah, where did I go? I went across the East Coast. I went to my hometown. I got to do a reading at my hometown bookstore where like my elementary school teacher showed up. It was really nice. I did some in California. I went to Texas and the Midwest. It was just a really incredible way to see so much of the country and talk to young women who were facing some of the same issues everywhere I went.
Yeah. What do you think has inspired you to be that champion for women?
I guess it always goes back to personal in some way. Like I faced a lot of that when I was beginning my career, and it was through beginning to meet with these other women, the Feminist Fight Club, that I realized it wasn't just my problem. It was like all of our problem, and thus it was an institutional problem. And if it was an institutional problem, we had more power in numbers to combat it if we worked together. And so I've always been like sort of an outraged person. Like I'm outraged about all sorts of stupid things all the time. Like maybe that's the New Yorker thing. And I'm also a journalist. So like I have this incredible privilege to be able to speak my mind in a lot of ways and for people to listen. So it has always felt like I'm in a good position to kind of push back on the status quo in some way. And doing it with the support of other people is incredibly important because, you're just so much more powerful when there's an army of you.
Right. And I want to piggyback on something you just said about being a journalist and having that platform. Do you have any advice for someone who's considering that as a career, or perhaps even someone who later in life is thinking they want to get into the writing game, and how to shake off that imposter syndrome, that fear to send maybe that first query letter? Do you have any advice in that regard?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing I would say is I still get imposter syndrome constantly and like don't want to send the pitch, or I get one pitch rejection and I can't handle it.
I'm quitting.
So yeah, so that never goes away. Maybe it does go away for some people. It hasn't gone away for me. But I think like don't let that hinder you, because even professional working writers feel it. And I'm writing a profile of a woman right now who's a poetry author, and we were talking about this as well. And she has a #1 New York Times bestseller. Like, everyone has this, so don't let that hold you back. And then I think like the beautiful thing that has happened since I began writing is you don't have to like move to the small town to get the newspaper job, or even move to the big city to get the magazine job anymore. You can blog from your house, or you can build a platform on Instagram, or you can make a podcast. Like, there's just so much more knowledge about how to create content. I sort of hate that word content. It's so overused, but everyone's a content creator.
Yes.
And so oftentimes independent people have built far larger audiences than I reach writing an article for a major mainstream media. And so that's just so encouraging. And there are all sorts of new ways to monetize and make a living out of it. And it's really, comparatively, like I went the really traditional route. And so it's been democratized in a way. And it's kind of like how photographers are probably so annoyed because everyone thinks they're a photographer now because we all have iPhones. And I'm definitely guilty of this. Yeah, well, I am a graphic designer, and professional designers are like, fuck you, you're not a graphic designer. But everyone can make media. And that can be a really powerful thing.
Yeah, for sure. Touch briefly on Girls at 18.
This was a project that we did as a special section of the New York Times that we then turned into a book. But basically the idea was, it was 2018. We wondered what 18-year-old girls around the world were doing, and we wanted to capture them, but we didn't want to do it through like the typical New York Times way where you like assign a professional photojournalist to go document these girls in different places and you're the adults like taking pictures of them in their bedroom or whatever. We wanted to bring the girls' lens onto the girls. And so what we did took a lot of thinking and editing and collaborating, but we decided to photograph these 18-year-old girls in their environments. It was in, I think, 21 different countries. And we would have them photographed by other teen photographers.
Wow.
And so this was a logistical nightmare because we began by locating professional photojournalists and mentors in every location, who then helped us find teenage photographers, who then presented us with 3 18-year-old girl subjects. And then we selected one. But it was one of those things where these other young women got such better access, both photographically and in the interviews that they conducted, which we guided them on, than I think we could have on our own as the grown-ups coming in, trying to talk to the girls.
More peer-to-peer than, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And 18 is just such a pivotal moment in people's lives. It's like, are you an adult? Are you a girl? Even the language, like whether we were calling them girls or women. In some places you can vote, in some places you can enlist in the army, in some places you can drink. It's like this real rite of passage. And there's all this data about how girls in particular lose their self-esteem around that age, and they're more likely to be married, and all of these things that really made us think that we needed to focus the lens specifically on young women.
Nice. That's great. So given this world that we're living in right now, where you can work from anywhere, does Jessica Bennett think she'll be working more from Yucca Valley, or?
Yeah,
not?
well, it's like the thing where you can work from wherever, but you can't travel between places.
Right.
So
Yeah.
like all year when we were, we've been in our one room Brooklyn apartment with 2 people trying to work from home. So like we listened to each other's horrible business voice on conference calls all day. It would have been very nice to come out here, but we just couldn't get there. So we're here from now, and we don't have the return flight, and we're going to see how everything goes and try to be as safe as we can. But one of the reasons why I switched my job and retired the gender editor position and took on this other role was so that I could spend more time out here and not have to be tied to my desk. And so now, of course, nobody's tied to their desks anymore, which is freeing, but also means you never have to change out of your pajamas.
I know. I have my pajama pants on right now.
Yeah, I mean,
I went to put pants on. I'm like, why are you doing that? She's not going to see that. Who cares?
Great for podcasting, though.
Exactly. Well, I want to thank you very much for coming on today and sharing a bit of your desert life with us. But before I let you go, I will pick out a couple of random questions from the famous jar. And this is part of the Diary Unlocked episode that is exclusive content for Patreon supporters of the Desert Lady Diaries podcast. Let's see what we have. The questions I'll be asking Jessica are, what was the first paying job you ever had and where was it? Leave the desert alone or should we build on it? Do you make plans or set goals for your life? How often do you do it? And how do you make sure you take action? The last question will be, if there were an extra hour today, what would you do with it? If you're listening and you want to hear Jessica's answers to those questions, go to desertladydiaries.com, click on the support tab, and check out the Patreon option. Thanks again for being here today. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
Shouting out this week to Mia B. and Anja M. Thanks so much for signing up for the new episode newsletter. This podcast is funded through the generosity of listeners like you. If you'd like to learn how you can chip in, visit the website desertladydiaries.com and click on the support page. Thanks so much for listening.